I call Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I'm very happy to take a brief call on this referral motion. A debate that we have in Parliament relatively rarely these days, and I think that is a good thing. And in fact, up until 4 years ago, we never would have had a debate on these matters. And I think it's important when they do come up that we canvass whether in fact it's valid for an earlier report back date, but also whether the powers that a select committee are being given, because in addition to truncating the report back date, this motion also gives the committee additional powers. It's worth us considering whether those additional powers are warranted. I was involved in the review of standing orders in 2011, which made the change to the standing orders, and a lot of thought was given as to whether these motions should indeed be debatable. And I want to quote briefly from the report as to the reasons why that change was made, because I think they summarise some of the arguments against voting in favour of the motion. And this is a direct quote: "The truncation of the select committee process can have serious implications for legislative quality and confidence in the legislative process. It also affects the public perception of Parliament, especially when submitters are required to prepare submissions in a short time and hearings are compressed." Now, that was the unanimous view of the committee. So it was not just one party arguing it, that was the view of the whole Parliament, that we wanted to avoid wherever possible the truncation of the select committee process. Now, the report goes on to say that while 6 months is the default, it can be reduced to 4 months without debate, but we don't want 6 months to necessarily be a constraint either. That was actually the finding of the report, that the select committee process should take as long as the select committee process should take. And what's important in that is that we don't have a minimum select committee timeframe either. So while a bill is referred to a select committee by the House, there is absolutely nothing to stop that committee reporting back early where it can be adequately dealt with in a shortened period of time, without the need for the House to mandate that they must report back within a shortened period of time. And as my colleague David Parker has pointed out, this bill has some complexity, and so they should take the time that is necessary for them to deal with those issues. They can report it back early now without the need for this referral motion if they find that in fact they don't need any additional time. The Standing Orders Committee noted that the government should exercise due restraint when considering the truncation of select committee process, and the reason these motions are debatable now when they previously weren't is exactly for that reason. If it takes up additional House time, then it is going to discourage the government from using them, and that is important. The other point that I want to make is around the powers that the Select Committee are being given. And one of the powers that they are being given, if this motion is passed, is the power to meet while the House is sitting. Now, my colleagues Phil Twyford and David Parker have talked about the complexity of the bill and the need for people submitting to be able to get their heads around the bill before they put their submissions before the Select Committee. There's also a need for the members on that Select Committee to be able to get their heads around those issues of complexity as well. And a time for them to adequately hear the submissions that are sent before them. The power to meet while the House is sitting actually, in my view, makes the Select Committee process much more complex and much more complicated for the members, and does actually in some ways inhibit the ability of the members to constructively engage, because it means that they're going to be balancing other priorities. Members will find themselves having to speak in the House, leaving select committees, coming and going from select committee hearings. If there's one of the things that I find select committee submitters do often complain about, is they feel like they were rushed through the process and they weren't actually listened to. And I think that that is heightened where they see members coming and going from the meeting during the time that they are making their submissions, because they feel that they're not being given the respect that they deserve. And I actually think that's a valid criticism. And when select committees meet while the House is sitting, the odds of that happening are much higher than if the select committee meets during its regular time. So I think that there is case for that to happen sometimes, and we do that regularly with extended sitting of the House where we're doing treaty settlement bills, for example, but they are non-contentious in the sense that they're well supported around the House, and so we'll allow select committees to meet during that time because we can arrange for the swaps and so on to happen so that the select committee work is still covered. So again, it's not a case of saying it should never happen, but we should be very cautious about hearing controversial issues in select committee, and this will almost certainly be controversial when the Houses are sitting and when members have other work responsibilities that they are trying to balance, because it will infringe upon their ability to adequately engage with the detail of the submissions and the detail of the legislation, which of course I'm not going to go into here because I'm not allowed to. But it is important that the members of the committee do engage in the detail and do get their heads around it, and that's why making sure that they have adequate time to do that is very important. So I want to finally quote again from the Standing Orders Committee in concluding my remarks, because I think that this really sums up the nature of the whole issue. Reducing the number of bills that are subject to shorter deadlines for Select Committee consideration will be an effective way of enhancing legislative scrutiny and thus improving the quality of legislation in New Zealand. We have a job as members of Parliament to scrutinise the legislation that comes before us. Truncated Select Committee processes are a barrier to that happening. We also have a responsibility to ensure that the legislation is quality legislation, lest we find ourselves back here, as we regularly have in recent times, correcting legislation that was pushed through in a hurry, that wasn't done properly, that didn't get the scrutiny it deserved, and therefore stood in need of correction. We can avoid those things by making sure that we follow the principle that the Standing Orders Committee was articulating of giving the bills all of the scrutiny that they deserve, and that means not truncating and constraining the power of the Select Committee to give it the time that it needs.
Members, the question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it. A party vote is called for. I'll ask the clerk to conduct a party vote.
New Zealand National.
59 votes in favour.
New Zealand Labour.
28 votes opposed.
Green Party.
13 votes opposed.
New Zealand First.
12 opposed.
Maori Party.
2 votes in favour.
Ag New Zealand.
1 in favour.
United Future.
1 in favour.
Members, the ayes are 63, the noes are 53. The motion is agreed to. Call on Government Order of the Day number 2.
Harmful